The weekly Cybercrime and Business podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. Hey everybody out there, today is Friday, June 12th, 2015. I'm Jeff Peters, the Surfwatch Labs editor. I'm here with Matt Leifus, Surfwatch Labs writer, and Michael Thel, Surfwatch Labs data analyst. Coming up after the discussion, we have an interview with Rich Schofield. He's the business development director of network integration at Dimension Data. And they just released their 2015 Network Barometer Report, looking at network statistics around the globe, and we talk about what's going on with network cybersecurity. But yeah, it's been a pretty busy week in terms of cybersecurity news, so I guess we'll just jump right into it and throw it over to you, Matt, for the top cyber headlines from Surfwatch Labs data.
Sure, and coming in at number 3, the third top trending story from the week was Italy. This is a global Italian food market, and they announced this week that they discovered a data breach of their systems. The breach took place over a 4-month period, starting in January of 2015 and ending in April. Any on-premise Italy restaurants, like in the New York City area and throughout the world, because it is a global market, they were not affected. However, Italy's New York City retail marketplace, that's what was affected in the breach. So any customer that made any purchases during that time frame, so again, the January to April 2015 time frame, their payment card information was potentially obtained. Coming in number 2, we have Kaspersky Lab. Kaspersky Lab acknowledged a data breach this week that they believe attempted to spy on their newer technologies. Cybercriminals used a new version of Duqu, which is being called Dooku 2.0 in the attack. Some files were successfully obtained. However, Kaspersky Lab says that these files were, quote, in no way critical to the operation of its products. Some, and we'll get into this a little bit later, guys, but there's a security expert that actually stated that this was the biggest cybersecurity news of the year so far. That's obviously up to debate, but we'll see. Kind of a big deal. And the number 1 trending target for the week was the United States Army website. The website for U.S. Army suffered a web defacement attack by the Syrian Electronic Army. The hacktivist group claimed credit for the attack via Twitter. Officials for the U.S. Army took down the website after they saw messages that said, "You've been hacked and your commanders admit they are training the people they have sent you to die fighting." Those are the top 3 trending stories for the week.
Yeah, so you mentioned this Duqu story might be the biggest cybersecurity news of the year. I guess we can start with what happened at Kaspersky Lab. There was a spear phishing attack there, and they believe that several 0 days were used. The spear phishing attack used a 0 day against an employee, but the malware was pretty sophisticated, and it actually wiped the employee's mailbox and their web browser in order to hide traces of the attack. Then after that, after they got onto the employee's computer, then they used another 0 day, which was patched by Microsoft in November 2014. That 0 day allowed an unprivileged domain user to elevate their credentials to get a domain administrator account. So then once they had that admin access, they were able to spread out and infect other computers. The first Duqu was believed to be a state-sponsored malware, which many people say is from Israel. And in 2011, Duqu 1.0 was spying on Iran's nuclear program. And so in this 2014 to 2015 infections, they found that several conferences and hotels that were hosting negotiations for the Iran nuclear talks were infected as well. So the thought is that Israel was behind this and trying to get that information. But yeah, it sounds like it's a pretty sophisticated piece of malware. So it definitely could be one of the more important stories of the year on that front. But on the other hand, since it's so specific and so targeted, for the majority of businesses out there, it's not something that's really necessarily going to affect them.
What I found interesting was that Symantec was able to get their hands on some of the Duqu information and ran it through their system, and they found that a European telecom operator was infected, a North African telecom operator was infected, and a Southeast Asian electronic equipment manufacturer was also infected with this. In addition to computers located in the US, UK, Sweden, India, and Hong Kong. And I think it's interesting, in my own opinion, that the 0 days are actually used against just a private organization. I mean, I'm sure it happens every day, but 0 days aren't cheap, let's just say. So burning them ought to learn this sort of information, that they must have been really desperate to find some sort of data on just sort of the state-sponsored campaigns that Kaspersky has been investigating.
Yeah, I was kind of laughing this morning reading Kaspersky's blog post and the report itself. Kaspersky Lab just seemed really proud of themselves that they found this, and there's a lot of chest beating about. They're almost sort of making fun of them, kind of like either they thought they wouldn't get caught or they didn't care if they get caught. They're like, basically, how dare they try to attack one of the greatest vendors out there? It was just kind of funny, I thought. But yeah, like you pointed out, Mike, over the past 5 years, Kaspersky has done reports on, Stuxnet, Duqu, Flame, Gauss, Region, the Equation Group. So whoever was behind this, if it was Israel, they might have wanted to get some more information on that research that they were doing. That was one really big story of the week, and I guess a lot of the stories have really had to do with this state-sponsored kind of attacks. The other big story that everyone was talking about was that the United States Office of Personnel Management, I saw today that several senators and other people have been saying that China was behind the attacks and throwing accusations their way. But what happened there, if you're a little behind on the news, is up to 4 million current and former federal employees may have had their information compromised. And the big thing that everyone's talking about here is it potentially includes things involving security clearances. I was reading a blog by John Schindler. He's a former counterintelligence officer for the NSA. And he said in his blog that it really doesn't get much worse than this. Whoever now holds those records possesses something like the Holy Grail from the counterintelligence perspective. For example, they would know, like the people that they were recruiting, whether they had a gambling habit, inability to pay bills, spats with former spouses, kind of all that personal information that they could leverage and try to turn people against the U.S. He was just talking about how, assuming it is China, they're going on the offensive, and that's why they're going after all this personal information to try to be on the offensive front in terms of the cyber warfare.
That's an interesting point. To add to it, I think it offers a lot of research on government employees who could be good targets for human intelligence collection. And that's a fancy way of saying to be spies. So they could either blackmail people or look at people who are having some sort of financial difficulty and throw money their way. That's a distinct possibility. One interesting tidbit from this I found out was in a Wall Street Journal article from yesterday was 4 people familiar with the investigation said the breach was actually discovered during a sales demonstration by a small cybersecurity firm from Virginia that does networks forensics, and that they're just running the sales demonstration and they found a bunch of malware on OPM systems. So that'd be more egg on OPM's face, where they didn't even know that somebody had to come in with offering a new product and they found this malware on their system.
Yeah, so this OPM breach could potentially be one of the bigger breaches of the year. And then we have this Dooku malware, which some people are saying could be the biggest cybersecurity news of the year. Also, there was news, I guess there was just a lot of news in the government sector. One thing that I noticed just recently was this researcher, Peter Kleisner, he put out a paper where he said at least 153 distinct machines are still infected with Stuxnet, which is kind of interesting considering that this Duqu malware is supposedly like kind of a stepbrother of Stuxnet. Everyone says Stuxnet was the U.S. and Israel, and it's believed that Duqu is kind of the Israeli sort of offshoot that they did on their own. But anyways, he managed to get control of 2 command and control servers for infected domains and spent about a year looking at them and found that there's still 153 machines infected with Stuxnet. So that's just another interesting story that came up on the government side. And I know, Matt, you've been posting a lot of stuff the past couple of days in the government sector on the site. So anything stand out to you?
What really stood out to me was the ways in which a lot of these targets were mentioned. There were a lot of different attack vectors and just ways the breach kind of happened. For instance, we have the Japan Pension Service, which I think we might have talked about last week. But just look at the government sector for the last 30 days. In the Japan Pension Service breach, that was caused through an employee opening up an email that they shouldn't have. You mentioned the Stuxnet story. We mentioned the U.S. Army, but then we had another web through the Air Force. This was by way of Anon Ghost. Well, let me see, what else did we have? We had Bundestag. Am I saying that right? It's German, guys, so I might have got that wrong. I don't speak German.
The Bundestag.
Bundestag. Okay. Well, this is a German lower parliament. They suffered a data breach, and there were some details about that. But I found it interesting that I just read something on that, an article about that today. As I was reading that, they were still affected with malware, and they were still leaking data everywhere. Officials that are investigating it and members of the German lower parliament there are saying that it's very likely that they're going to just have to replace 20,000 computers, which is going to cost like millions of euros to do. And I thought that was kind of interesting because they're just going to, from what I read, they're not. Does that mean they're not able to fix the problem or get rid of the malware? They're just going to replace all these computers. I thought that was pretty interesting as well. But there were just a lot of government news this week. A lot of stuff showed up in data.
Yeah, in addition to all this government stuff, there was a couple big stories from the past kind of rearing their head this week. Silk Road creator Ross Ulbright, he was sentenced to life in prison, although I read that he's appealing that. I think it was the FBI did a raid on a house in Chicago, I believe it was, that was tied to all the celebrity iCloud nude photos that were leaked back in October 2014. And then another kind of interesting story you don't really see too often was a man was robbed at gunpoint, and I believe he was stabbed as well, because he put on, I think on Craigslist, he wanted to sell some Bitcoins, and he ended up meeting some people and basically robbed his virtual currency in a physical way. But yeah, before we get too long here, wrap it up with the cyber tip of the week.
Yeah, last week, OpenDNS released a study, and it was about IoT, or Internet of Things. That the study included responses from 500 IT and security professionals. There was obviously a lot of information on that, but one thing that really stood out to me, 23%, so you're talking more than 100 of the IT and security professionals responded that their organizations had no security in place to keep unauthorized IoT devices from connecting to their network, which I kind of thought was a pretty big deal. This week we had TrapX actually discovered an exploit that they're calling MedJack. And what this is an attack criminals are using against unpatched medical IoT devices, and they're using them as a pivot point to ultimately gain access to the organization's network. So, here we have an example of we're using an IoT device to ultimately kind of get the bigger fish, and it can leave a company vulnerable. So, I thought that was pretty interesting and something that we're probably going to hear about a lot more in the future. IoT-related hacks and vulnerabilities.
All right, now coming up, we have our interview with Rich Schofield, where we talk about the 2015 Network Barometer Report. Dimension Data just released the Network Barometer Report 2015. Obviously, there's a lot of information in that report, but just wondering if you could highlight a couple key points that stand out from the networks around the globe.
Yeah, well, look, we really have focused on kind of four major areas of findings, right? How old technology is, how fit clients' environments are to support some of the newer connectivity technologies, what what incident data and what kind of problems in networks clients are finding, as well as the security posture. So we kind of focus on those 4 key themes, at least for this year. And and we do that worldwide across our whole database.
I guess my first question is there anything that stood out to you or surprised you when you looked at the findings that maybe you didn't expect to see?
Well, that's an interesting question as well. I think it's always surprising to us that no matter how old clients' networks are getting, they seem to get a little older and older every year, which just means to us that clients are still very resistant to renovating their environments unless there's really a need. So I would say that surprises me. We're kind of up from 51% of devices in the aging or obsolete category last year, up to 53% this year. And also the number of devices with at least one security vulnerability, at least in the Americas, up at 74%. That's a little surprising. I would have expected that to be a little bit lower, probably north of 50%, but I would have expected, lower than 74.
Yeah, so I wonder if you could elaborate on that. I mean, why is there so much resistance to upgrading? Because a lot of the experts that we talk to on our podcast and other places, they always talk about how there's all these outdated equipment, and that's part of the reason for a lot of these cyber attacks and breaches that we see. Wondering maybe if you agree with that, or if you could kind of expand on why you think there's resistance to that upgrading.
Yeah, I do think there is some merit to that argument, Jeff, absolutely. But I think the focus for clients is that I think they don't want to be told that they need to renovate their environment just because a product has been put on a life cycle schedule by the manufacturer. Because just because it's been put on a life cycle schedule doesn't mean that it's past its useful life. And many times clients they have a hard time getting to time to value for a renovated environment because new features, new capabilities are becoming more and more esoteric. And they're creating kind of a consumption gap because the clients, while they might renovate the environment in order to both address the obsolescence, but also maybe some of these new features, are unable to actually monetize them because they take specialized skills that they typically don't have access to. It's almost like the fancy features in Microsoft Word, for example. What percentage of the features in Microsoft Word do you think the average user uses? 20%? Yeah. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I guess one thing that surprised me was, I believe that it said in the report that networks in the Americas are among the most outdated and vulnerable. That surprised me. Just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about why that is and what that means.
Well, I think one of the biggest reasons for that probably is just because it's almost kind of the same argument that's made for why is it that, let's say, our telecom infrastructure is older. They're putting in new networks in other parts of the world, and they're installing fiber everywhere, and we don't have that in the U.S., and it's mainly because we get started earlier. So I think that's a lot of the reason. And again, once the equipment's in and operating, the longer the stuff is in there and operating and burns in, what we found in our trouble ticketing data is that actually the failure rate for the equipment goes down. There's certainly fewer software bugs, and they've been sitting in the network and burned in for so long that any problems in the electronic components themselves has long gone by the board. So we're finding the failure rates are somewhat lower for the older gear. So again, I think it's all a matter of the financial situation, the macroeconomic situation, and needing really an architectural-based discussion that you need to have with the client instead of a calendar-based discussion as to when to renovate their environments.
Yeah, and another thing that I read in the report, just conventional wisdom was that some of these aging networks would get upgraded, and that conventional assumption really hasn't come true. So just wondering, maybe looking out a couple years, is it something that you think we'll continue to see, the networks getting older, or do you think that maybe we have a new sort of conventional wisdom where things are kind of shifting?
No, I think that clients will continue to renovate obsolete gear. If you look in detail into the information and the statistics around this latest report we put out, while the percentage of aging and obsolete together increased, the percentage of obsolete went down a bit and the percentage of aging went up. So I think what you'll find is that we'll probably continue clients will continue to renovate their obsolete infrastructure, keep a closer watch on that, maybe flip it over, even if it's just for the reason that it's not supported by the manufacturer anymore, but sweat the aging gear, the other gear out for as long as they can, because why not?
One quote that I found interesting in there, talking on this podcast, a lot of people bring up the Internet of Things and bring your own devices and mobility and things like that in terms of cybersecurity. And it said that the lack of strategic investment has resulted in organizations not preparing for the significant impact of mobility, collaboration, and the Internet of Things on corporate networks. So just wondering if you have any thoughts, maybe from a cybersecurity or cybercrime standpoint, if you think that might have, I guess, any impact going forward?
Yeah, my expertise is not so much in the security space, so there are others in my organization who could comment better, but I would have to say that in general that's true, mainly because we can see that IPv6 isn't being adopted at the rate you would think, because the proliferation of devices, of attached IP addresses that will be needed is going to far outstrip the remaining IP addressing. I think I read an article that had that finally actually really expiring in the middle of the summer this year. So we'll see if that actually happens. And then also we all know that the security functions and capabilities in IPv6 are in excess of those in IPv4. So I think that's one of the reasons why that's pointed out to be an issue. And then also the fact that the equipment, particularly in the United States, has such a high percentage of security vulnerability. So I think that is a factor, but I think we're still a ways away from really the Internet of Things kind of hitting that plateau of productivity. We're kind of in the hype cycle with it.
The Americas was the only region in which networks were more vulnerable than last year, and the percentage of devices with at least one vulnerability rose from 67% to 73%. Wondering if that's a concern or if that's something that was expected with the data you guys found?
So you're asking me if we felt that that's a significant concern for organizations in the United States?
Yeah, just wondering maybe a little background on why that number rose 6% from 67 to 73.
I think there's a combination of factors, really, Jeff. I think number one is that clients have security bug fatigue. Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems like you can hardly go a day when there's not something new. So I think a lot of organizations, and we certainly consult with organizations in this way, we look closely at the risk profile of the particular security vulnerability to determine whether it's really impactful for the client and whether it makes sense to, based upon that, upgrade the operating system software. So I think organizations are getting maybe a little more selective about that. I think that's one reason. On top of the kind of the security bug fatigue. And then I think also is that the more lines of code in software, the more software intensive something is, just the more likely that there are bugs in the first place. So I think the number of bugs found continues to escalate, So I would say that would be my answer.
That's pretty much all the questions I have, unless there's anything else that stood out to you about the report that you wanted a quick chat about.
No, I think the only other thing that I particularly found, you did ask a question at the beginning, did I find anything surprising? And there is actually one other thing that I did find surprising that I think is worthy of note, which was the decrease in mean time to repair when an organization is online to their maintenance provider. We did a simple analysis and comparison between assets that we maintain where we're also monitoring and managing them and when we're not monitoring and managing them. And what we found is that actually the troubleshooting the troubleshooting period is actually 75% shorter, which I thought was amazing. And then the overall mean time to repair was down by 32%. So I would say that that's another thing that's probably worthy of note that people may find very interesting in the report.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time, Rich. We appreciate it.
By all means.
Thanks for listening to this week's Cybercrime and Business podcast. As always, you can find us on your favorite place to listen, whether that's iTunes, YouTube, Podbean, SoundCloud, Stitcher, all the major podcasting sites. And for more information, check out surfwatchlabs.com.